It's over 37 years since I stood on this very spot to deliver a speech opposing the motion that socialism will triumph. And listening to my friends opposite, I'm beginning to think nothing much has actually changed. Well, this place, I must admit, has. It's rather like Britain itself. It's considerably less down at heel, indeed considerably more prosperous than those dark days of the 1970s. 1970s, of course, I conveniently forgot. None of the speakers opposite actually remember the 1970s. The Treasurer, I'm afraid, was too young, and our two distinguished speakers opposite didn't live in the UK. Let me help them remember the socialist utopia that the Occupy movement would have us believe in. So I'm rather skeptical generally when I think back to endless strikes, power cuts, 3-day weeks, unburied bodies, uncollected rubbish, untreated patients, IMF bailouts, 98% marginal rates of taxation, and university for a small minority of highly privileged students. If that is the Marxist socialist world the Occupy movement suggests is our utopia, I promise you, please keep it. I'm going back to Australia. I will willingly concede that in the first decade of this millennium, many banks were extremely poorly managed, senior managers totally failed to promote the right culture, and they failed to protect the hard-won reputations for trust and probity that people had every right to expect from their banks. I would absolutely accept that failure on both sides of the Atlantic to bring a single banker, as they say, bang to rights, has made people understandably angry. You know, like a thirsty traveler in the desert, they drank the water only to find that it was sand, and they want proper retribution. But that is when the world gets very dangerous, as it did in the 1930s after the last great financial crisis. Because these crises create the most convenient bandwagons for those whose overarching political objective is not, as they claim this evening, to improve the financial system, but to remodel the entire form of government, indeed society as a whole. And I have no problem with people with those views. I just want them to make it very clear and not hide behind rhetoric around what they claim to stand for. Now, you know, these bandwagons take many forms. I am sure my colleague on this side, Mr. Hannam, will talk about one form that we're seeing at the moment, which is the Europeans who are using the financial crisis to pretend that in protecting people through another financial crisis, their real objective is to create a unified Europe. I don't mind if that's their objective. I just want them to be honest about it. What all this means is that improving the financial system does not mean dismantling it. You cannot have a free democratic society without free banks. Banks which ensure the free movement under law of capital from those with the capital to those like Mr. Damlin with the ideas. Wonga is no different from other disruptive businesses, whether based on new concepts or new technologies. Entrepreneurs do not flourish in socialist utopias. New businesses and new technologies arise from capitalism, not communism, and certainly not anarchism, which leads us, of course, conveniently to the Occupy movement. Let's be very clear about Occupy. As one of the many websites carrying the Occupy brand name makes clear, the only solution is world revolution. So let's be clear, we're not dealing here with a modest or woolly objective. Now, if anyone doesn't believe me, the Treasurer clearly doesn't, let me just quote again. Occupy Wall Street is a leaderless resistance movement with people of many colours, genders, and political persuasions. The one thing we all have in common, the only thing we have in common, is we are the 99%. Not quite sure what that means. We are using the revolutionary Arab Spring tactic to achieve our ends, all pretty reasonable. No frightening leaders, entirely non-violent, against greed and corruption. It's standard motherhood and apple pie stuff, particularly when you throw in something like the Arab Revolution for good measure. Now, I was lucky. I actually watched and lived through the Occupy movement at close quarters. My office overlooks St. Paul's in London. And to be fair, when it started, the protesters garnered considerable support from very many unlikely quarters for precisely the reasons I stated earlier, the populist myth of casino bankers operating in a cesspit. But as the months passed, the support faded away. Occupy sank under the weight of its own contradictions. You know, was St. Paul's churchyard really the same as Tahrir Square? You know, many people find that association somewhat demeaning to the extraordinary brave men and women throughout the Arab world who have stood up against the tanks and guns of oppressive, undemocratic regimes. What do they actually want to achieve? There's a really good short film on YouTube, A Matter of Judgment, which brilliantly displays the ragtag and bobtail of the protests. Slogans such as abolish war against another slogan saying eliminate Israel. Jobs for all against the slogan no to industry. It was all very confusing. Do socialist revolutionaries really need daily Ocado deliveries or a regular refill at that capitalist icon Starbucks? Workers of the world unite. The only people who suffered through the Occupy were some liberal Church of England clerics who were forced to resign, and the most lowly paid shop workers and bar attendants in and around Paternoster Square who lost their jobs because the area was closed for the Occupy movement. Then I thought, it's okay. Occupy in Wall Street is going to be different. And I'd rather hope that my friend Mr. David Graeber was going to be here in person tonight to enlighten us on this. He isn't, so I looked at his article in The Guardian earlier this year. And what was his main line? The Treasurer should listen to this carefully. Those early months of Occupy, he said, saw a veritable invasion from liberal groups. Before long, occupiers realized the help was threatening to destroy them. Meetings became bureaucratized as they turned into a boring and endless discussion about money. How unbelievably inconvenient, wrestling with the challenges of actually running something serious. But he's thrilled now. And the reason? The liberals have all gone. The revolution can continue. Revolutionary anarchism, he writes, is the future as militant tactics come to the fore and direct confrontations become the norm. And perhaps that's why only this last weekend in New York, Roberto Rivera was charged for the possession of large quantities of bomb-making chemicals, assault rifles, and other firearms as a leading supporter of the Occupy movement. Now, call me old-fashioned, but the problem with revolutionary anarchism, pretty much revolutionary anything, is it's certainly never democratic. It always ends badly. Reform is not the objective of Occupy. Would that it was. Would that Occupy was part of a movement to have a serious discussion about the future of the financial industry. That's not what Occupy is there to do. It's about global revolution. That's what it says on the tin. And for once, look at the tin and read it. Occupy has latched onto each and every protest movement in order not to bring about sensible reforms, in my view, much needed reforms, but to bring about the entire restructuring of society. Fine if that's what you want, but don't kid yourself that in supporting Occupy, you're achieving modest or even substantial changes to the financial institutions. So if you came here tonight thinking that Occupy is just about banking and Wall Street, which I have to say would not have been a necessarily unreasonable conclusion, please think again. If you walk through the I lobby, you will be endorsing not the pleasurable prospect of public flagellation of people like me, you'll be endorsing a movement which is dedicated to the overthrow of our entire economic and social fabric. If you don't believe me, read the latest book by one of the true heroes of Occupy, Zizek, called The Year of Dreaming Dangerously. It should be compulsory reading for any liberal tempted to support Occupy. He argues the worst crime of all is to try to alleviate the suffering caused by capitalism, remembering the stinging Leninist denunciation of those who wanted to help flood victims in Russia, who he said, quotes, exhibit the saccharine sweet sentimentality of the bourgeoisie. I'm glad to say that at least in this respect, Occupy has departed from some of these sentiments in helping the victims of Hurricane Sandy. The Occupy movement is no more or no less than a leech which is attaching itself to a widespread dislike, possibly even revulsion, against the activities, I'm afraid to say, Mr. Damlin, of a minority of so-called professionals who try to steal everyone's present. Please don't let Occupy compound those sins by campaigns which is going to turn your futures, your children's futures, and your grandchildren's futures to stand. Mr. President, I beg to oppose the motion, and in doing so, I urge you to reaffirm the beliefs that I'm glad to say 37 years ago this House triumphantly proclaimed. I beg to oppose.